strange. Girl, put your records on, tell me your favorite song. You go ahead, let your head down. Sapphire and faded jeans, I hope you get your dreams. Just go ahead, let your head down. You're gonna find yourself somewhere, somehow. Just more than I could take, pity for pity's sake. Some nights kept me awake. I thought that I was stronger. When you're gonna realize that you don't even have to try any longer. Do what you want to, girl, put your records on. Tell me your favorite song. I wanna get numb and forget where I'm from. 'Cause looking in your eyes, like looking at the sun. I feel like you're the moon, I feel like I'm the one. I wanna get numb, 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 numb. I wanna get numb and forget where I'm from. 'Cause looking in your eyes, like looking at the sun. I feel like you're the moon, I feel like I'm the one. I wanna get numb, 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 numb. Wanna get numb, go crazy, wanna wild out. 'Cause lady, life's so short but amazing. Late night party in the basement, hotel lobby and I'm wasted. Just reached into my savings, I'll do it too if you take it. Yeah, life's only what you make it. I wanna get numb and forget where I'm from. 'Cause looking in your eyes, like looking at the sun. I feel like you're the moon, I feel like I'm the one. I wanna get numb, 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 numb. I just wanna get lost tonight and dance with you. I just wanna get way too high, let's set the mood. You're my fantasy, yeah. I don't wanna fall asleep, yeah. There's nothing in this world I'd rather do. I wanna get numb and forget where I'm from. 'Cause looking in your eyes, like looking at the sun. I feel like you're the moon, I feel like I'm the one. I wanna get numb, 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 numb. I wanna get numb and forget where I'm from. 'Cause looking in your eyes, like looking at the sun. I feel like you're the moon, I feel like I'm the one. I wanna get numb, 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 numb.
Please take your seats. The program will begin in 5 minutes.
I wanna get numb, 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 numb.
I said I love you for life, but I just sold our house. We were kids at the start, I guess we're grown-ups now. Couldn't ever imagine even having doubts, but not everything works out. No, now I'm out dancing with strangers. You could be casually dating. Damn, it's all changing so fast. I see love it, I see it. Yeah, that's just life, baby. Yeah, love came around and it knocked me down, but I'm back on my feet. I see love it, I see it. Yeah, that's just life, baby. I was barely standing, but now I'm dancing. He's all over me. But a bum 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 bum. But a bum 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 bum. But a bum bum bum
Please take your seats. The program is about to begin.
Picture a place where it all doesn't hurt, where everything's safe and it doesn't get worse. Oh my, we see through bloodshot eyes. Picture a place somewhere else far away, where you know what they mean and they mean what they say to us. And would that be enough? Are we running out of time? Are we hiding from the light? Are we just too scared to fight for what we want tonight? Close your eyes and leave it all behind. Know our love is on our side. It's a trust fall, baby. It's a trust fall, baby.
Please take your seats. Our program will begin now.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bloomberg Sustainable Business Summit. We're all here for a simple reason. We recognize that climate change is not only a major economic and financial risk, it's also a major economic and financial opportunity. Our team at Bloomberg is committed to bringing more data and more transparency to the efforts you're spearheading every day. As part of those efforts, we are building a new tool that will put accurate climate-related corporate data in one place, free of charge, empowering users to make sound business and investment decisions. We're also working closely with the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero to help financial institutions cut emissions across their entire portfolios. This work is complicated, but it couldn't be more important, and we all have a role to play in helping the private sector lead from the front. I hope this summit helps galvanize new partnerships and momentum. Thanks for coming, and all the best.
Please welcome to the stage Meg Szabo, Senior Editor for Bloomberg Green and Sustainability Events.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so thrilled to be hosting you here in our New York office. We have a great program ahead filled with scalable solutions and innovative ideas for your sustainability goals. But first, just a couple of quick announcements. We would love to acknowledge our summit advisor, Principal Financial Group. We would love to hear from you today. You can find the Wi-Fi information on the back of your badge. And you can also submit questions and respond to our polls using that QR code that's behind me. You can also engage with us on social media using the hashtag SustainableBizSummit. And with that, let's get started. We'd like to begin with a look at a conversation with Pete Stavros for a conversation with Bloomberg's Sonali Basak on private equity and employee ownership.
And Pete, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
What a timely moment to have you to talk about sustainability, especially in the vein of labor. We're watching historic strikes take corporate America. You look at what happened at Kaiser just recently, what's happening with the United Auto Workers. When you see what's happening, what does this tell you about the bigger picture on how labor is fitting into the story on sustainability in corporate America?
Well, I think these are all symptoms of a broken social contract between companies and labor, between capital and labor. So whether it's in healthcare or in autos or the writer's strike, we've got issues around wages. I mean, even with all of the increase in wages, net of inflation, are still pretty much flat. So people are still struggling to get by. And the wealth divide is so enormous, and the lack of wealth in the bottom half of the country is such a problem that it amplifies all of the other issues around staffing shortages, people feeling like they're overworked because they're not getting anywhere. And so, employee ownership, which I know we're going to talk about, I'm not saying it's going to magically solve all of our labor issues, but I think it could be a part of fixing this social contract. So workers are going to get a stake in the outcome. They can build real wealth. They're going to have a voice in their workplace. They're going to understand where the business is headed if we do a good job of creating these ownership cultures. And that's what we're trying to do, is make this ownership mindset and sharing ownership a part of this new social contract.
Now let's talk more about ownership works, what you're doing at KKR. The idea here, the private equity pitch, is give employees more ownership of the company, give them equity. How does that start to solve the problem, and what are the limitations of the fix?
And so the problems are, as I mentioned, the lack of wealth among workers, but also low engagement levels. So Gallup, as you probably know, is the 800-pound gorilla in employee engagement surveys. 70% of Americans don't like their job. 15 to 20% of employees at any individual company hate their employer. Gallup describes them as actively disengaged. So they are throwing the proverbial wrenches in the machines, literally trying to hurt the company that they work for. The Treasury Department does a survey every year about financial literacy. 2/3 of Americans are financially illiterate. They can't answer 5 basic personal finance questions. So there's a lot of, the quit rate, so that the percentage of Americans voluntarily walking out the door every year spiked to 40%. So 4 in 10 Americans quit in their job every year, which is bad for people because they're not building skills. They're just bouncing from job to job. It's bad for companies. It's bad for the economy. So those are some of all of our issues. And to your point on how far can we go with ownership and fixing these, it's not going to solve them entirely, but certainly it can help with wealth creation. Certainly it can help with employee engagement and this issue of 70% of Americans not liking their job. If they have information about what is actually going on with the company, how they can contribute, and getting real information. Financial literacy, there's a lot of work being done in the country on financial literacy. We're making no progress. And the reason is, even when a benefit is offered, workers don't engage on the financial literacy training because they have no hope, because they have no assets. Why am I going to go spend time with a coach if I don't own anything? So I think we can get a long way with ownership in this broader sense.
Yeah, let's take public companies just as an example here, because you have auto workers, for example, fighting for more pay. And they look at the CEOs of the company and their pay is just skyrocketing relative to their own. A lot of that is inequity. So when you're talking to employees of a company, how hard is it to get them to want equity rather than cash? Is it a hard sell?
So this is a fundamental, and I'm glad you raised this, a fundamental point, which is equity cannot be a trade for wages. So this is not about having workers risk benefits or wages or other forms of retirement planning to get some stock. That would be bad finance theory, because a big concentrated bet on one stock is not smart. And when it's your employer, you're already levered to your employer's success. And then if the employer has a problem and you lose your job and you lose your retirement, that's a disaster. So the whole idea here is stock for workers is incremental, it's free, they don't buy it. And then you say, well, what's in it for the company? What the company gets is a better culture, is lower quit rates. You know, we have case studies, and none of this happens fast. This takes like a decade sometimes. But we have case studies where the quit rate dropped 90%. So we have a company that over the course of 10 years, at the end of the journey, was hiring 3,000 fewer people every year. And the engagement scores went from the 20th percentile to the 90th. So that's the payback, is you have a more engaged workforce, happier on the job, they want to contribute, They're not walking out the door. That's the payback. It's not a trade for wages.
Now, KKR is already doing this with a lot of companies. More than 60,000 non-management employees have received kind of this benefit, if you will. Let's take a quick look here at a case study that KKR has given us for this program.
Imagine you wake up on a random Wednesday in the middle of your life, and everything that you've ever wanted to do in your life, you can do now. All because you did work and you did things the right way, and someone held up their word to you.
All right. This is a little different than when we normally get together. Anybody want to have an owners meeting?
We do have some news to share, and the news is we found a new owner for the business. So, logical question would be, what does this mean for you financially? Because you're all owners in this business. You guys ready to get into it? Even our newest colleagues are going to get a meaningful payout of $20,000. Well, if you think that was good, hold on to your hats. If you joined last year, the payout is $40,000. So for this cohort, the payout is 1.5 times annual pay. So the average payout is $70,000 for this group.
And that was a very abbreviated version of this was a much longer presentation. That was just in one of the manufacturing plants. If you follow through to the end of that, you know, we had truck drivers make almost $1 million. I mean, this was not a token amount of ownership. And the company did amazingly well. I mean, for those who are financially inclined, the EBITDA margins, the measure of profitability in this business, went from 20%, which would have already been top quartile for a manufacturer, to almost 40%, which is like a software company. And it was all driven by, over many years, these little productivity initiatives that the entirety of the workforce pulled together to make happen. So it was, you know, it's one of these things where, yes, it's a great story for workers, but, you know, our investors made 10 times their money on a garage door company, which people would have said, it's not possible. How could you possibly have that kind of an outcome? And it's because of what the entirety of the workforce came together and was able to drive.
It's funny, you saw people cheering when they said they had a new owner. Usually private equity is scary to people when they come in and buy a company. How is this kind of changing the image of private equity, especially now that KKR is not the only one doing this? You have signed up many of your rivals to start doing this as well.
Yes, and this is not about trying to burnish the image of private equity. This employee ownership effort, it is broad. You know, Ownership Works, which is a nonprofit foundation that my wife and I started to try and make this a more common effort and to help CEOs roll this model out, because it's difficult. It sounds so easy. We could talk about that. This is very hard to do. And we do have almost 100 organizations that are a part of this now. We've got, we think, a path to creating $20 billion of wealth across all of our partners for workers over the next 10 years, which in the context of the total lack of wealth in the bottom half of the country is a very big deal. But we are working with public companies. We worked with Harley-Davidson. It was a story that Bloomberg covered. We have no financial interest in Harley. The CEO just called out of the blue and said, I got brought in to turn this company around. I'm inheriting a not great relationship with the workforce and with the union. We need to really turn a new page here. And the totality of this model intrigues me, not just ownership, but worker voice and communications and financial literacy. Could you work with us to help roll this out? So it's public companies, it's family-owned businesses, it's small business. There's a lot here that we could tackle. One last thing, the power of private equity in this context is it's such an effective governance model. So take that Harley-Davidson example. I spent many, many months with the CEO and the board rolling this out, getting people comfortable, and it impacted 4,000 workers, all union, by the way. There's a big misconception that unions don't want ownership. That is not true. But if I spent that same amount of time convincing the CEO of a private equity firm to do this, you could have 500,000 workers, because there's so many companies that roll up to a very consolidated set of decision makers.
And I should say, if you have questions for Pete, please do submit them. We may have some time to take a few questions. You mentioned unions. We started in that space, in this idea that there has been a huge tension between unions and employers. What are your conversations looking like, and how does this really play a role in the story?
So we spend a fair bit of time. Here's what I would say the mindset of a union leader is. there's a lot of unfairness in the economy. We need to get a better place in wages, staffing levels, worker voice, but also we need to help, as we all know, defined benefit pension plans are gone. 401ks are great if you can afford to contribute. How can workers get anywhere? And union leaders are saying this may help. You know, it's not the solution, but what's wrong with getting more alignment between workers and a company? Sorry.
Well, one thing you and I have talked about before is this idea that if you're building wealth in America these days, a traditional way you used to do it was to buy a house and watch that equity grow. It's very difficult to buy a house for many Americans today. How does having equity in a company start to change some of that story?
Yeah. If working folks don't have savings, they can't put a down payment on a home, and they can't invest in stocks, obviously. So this can start to change the story because it's not an investment. It's a free benefit that can compound at high rates of return. I mean, the problem, if you look at Federal Reserve data on household wealth, there's a lot of talk about housing. The only thing that matters is stock ownership. If you look at the numbers, it is by far the biggest problem we have in wealth inequality. So the first year the Fed gives data is, I believe, 1989. And at that point in time, the top 10% of Americans had $1.7 trillion of wealth, and the bottom half of the country had, I think, $50 billion. Now we go 33 years later, where are we? That $1.7 trillion gap is now $30 trillion. So the top 10%, which had $1.7 trillion, have $30 trillion. And the bottom half have gone nowhere. They've went from 50 billion to 200 billion. So how did that happen? As we know, stocks compound at high rates over long periods of time. Yes, there's volatility, but over long periods of time, stocks do well, better than housing. And we're going to have to get appreciating assets in the hands of the bottom half of the country, or that 30 trillion is going to be 300 trillion, that gap. And it'll blow the whole system up. So we've got to find a way to, appreciating assets have got to be spread more broadly.
Now, we've been talking a lot about what this means for the employee, but what about the investor? I recall a conversation I had about a couple of years ago with the CEO of CalPERS. We were talking about ESG data and the importance of monitoring that data over time. And to her, we were talking about Scope 1, Scope 2 emissions, but importantly, we were also talking about employee turnover, employees being able to be engaged in their companies. What is the data that you have? What is the evidence that you have that more engaged employees that have a stake in the game, kind of like a money manager would, how does that lead to better outcomes?
So the gold standard metrics, and CalPERS is one of our core partners in all of this, are the gold standard metrics around how employees are feeling and what they're contributing to a company are the quit rate and employee engagement. A survey issued by someone like a Gallup. Those are the gold standard metrics. So we've got a lot of data that when this is done well, and as I mentioned earlier, this is hard. It's not like you hand out some stock and people stop quitting and engagement scores go up. This is a multi-year effort with tons of communication, education, training, information sharing, soliciting people's input, giving them more control over the work. This is very hard, but when it's done well, what you see is quit rates go down and engagement scores go up. Now, the point of your question is, okay, great, then what? And what we've seen, and we've spent so much time with economists at Harvard and Stanford and MIT, and it's very difficult to then say, and productivity gains were driven this much because you had more engaged employees who were less likely to quit. That's really hard. So what you'd have to do is basically have perfect control sample to compare to a group of companies that you are rolling this model out with, and then a bunch that you don't, and they have to be identical, and it's not possible. So where we stop is we're going to prove employees will become less likely to quit, more engaged on the job, and in aggregate, we're going to have better, the end results are going to be better, which is what we've seen. I mean, the 10 or so companies we've exited have been among the best deals we've done in the last decade where we've had this model. So we're convinced this leads to superior results for everybody, workers and investors alike, and that's what our investors believe as well.
It seems like it's not that hard of a fix on the face of it, in the sense that how hard is it to say, okay, you know, yes, you still would have to increase wages and do X, Y, and Z to make your workforce more engaged, but also if you do this thing where you give employees a stake in the game, things can be better. Why is it so hard then for this to take off? What resistance do you get from other private equity firms, owners, and CEOs?
Okay, so if we start with CEOs and we talk about this program, a CEO will say, okay, Pete, so just so I understand what you're asking me to do in the next 5, 6, 7 years is you want me to double earnings. You want me to decarbonize. You want me to diversify the board, the C-suite, and change the way we recruit to add diversity throughout the entirety of the company. You want the financials by the 12th of the month. You want, and there's such a long list around water, waste, energy. And then, if I understand you right, now you want me to figure out how to turn like 17,000 people in 80 countries, owners in the business, teach them about the company, drive employee engagement, teach them financial literacy, lower the quit rate. What do you want me to do? Because I can't do all of that. And the magic is if we can get that CEO to understand if he or she does those last things well, all the other priorities are going to be so much easier to tackle. But there's a huge initial pushback of like, oh my goodness, how am I going to do this? And that's also what part of what Ownership Works is there to do, is to help people who really want to go on this journey do it. I would say, honestly, that's the biggest obstacle, is CEOs are drowning in priorities.
So there's another element of this. You made this amazing anecdote a little earlier about a truck driver you had been working with that ended up with $1 million at the end through the equity he was able to amass through his time working. How often does a story like that happen?
So that was an unusual case. We don't often have blue-collar folks make $1 million. But I think what we also try to clearly communicate is it does not have to be a 10x, like, unbelievable transaction for people to do well. So we exited, just in recent months, Minnesota Rubber and Plastics, it was a good deal for us. It wasn't, a blowout. It was good. And workers made 100% of their income as an incremental free benefit in stock. We exited RB Media, an audiobooks business. Same thing. People who had at least been there a couple years earned 100% of their income in stock. And these are deals we will do over and over and over again. These are not 10x deals. So sometimes the headlines drift towards the amazing outcomes, which we also like to talk about. Where we do want to be clear, this doesn't need to be magic. I mean, this can work where you grind out solid transactions and people participate and it's meaningful. And by the way, I want to reiterate, it's not just about the stock and the money. This is about how they feel. Do they feel trusted? Do they feel respected? And ownership, in some regards, is the ultimate form of trust and respect. I respect you enough to make you an owner. I trust you enough to be sharing our profit margins. I mean, that's a big shift.
So this is something that you've done as the global co-head of private equity at KKR. It's also something you've done in your personal life through your nonprofit. What is the next phase of this for you?
That's a great question. Not ready to talk too much about it at the moment, but there's a policy effort that's coming. We need help from the government to really scale this. So hopefully we will be ready to launch that before too long. I've been working with a major university to establish an employee ownership center. We need more research into this. And we need to take a shot at massively scaling this. We've had some good case studies. I'm very proud that we've got over 100,000 workers across at Ownership Works in these programs. Even if they make $50,000, that's $5 billion of wealth. I mean, the numbers are so big. And I think we'll get to 20 billion, as I said, in the next 10 years. But we need to try this. What we're doing now isn't working. I think this could be part of a different kind of approach.
Pete, we thank you so much for your time. What a way to kick off the sessions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Abigail Ross Hopper, President and CEO of the Solar Energy Industries Association; Victoria Mills, Managing Director at the Environmental Defense Fund; and Basil Segarra, Commissioner of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Leslie Kaufman.
Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you today. I'm Leslie Kaufman. I'm with Bloomberg Green. Today, we're here to talk about truly an impactful piece of legislation, and you can't say that about a lot of pieces of legislation. We're here to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. A lot of people think it was misnamed. It's not attacking inflation, but it is a very important climate bill and tool. already, and these are just some of the statistics we've published, and these are a little old. I'm sure our panel will update us. It's generated $86 billion in private investment, 120,000 clean energy jobs, 91 battery factories, and 51 solar panel plants. And that's, from when we first did it. And that's only a year into the law. So we're going to talk about that in detail. Before we get going, though, I want to remind everyone that you can use the QR code to post questions. So before we begin our discussion, if you want to submit questions to our speakers, we'll get to those at the end of the panel. And we also have a poll, which we'd like you to take part of. How will the IRA implementation most impact your company or industry? And your choices are job creation, cost savings, access to capital, still figuring it out, or no impact. So we'd love to hear what you have to say on that. So to get going, I'm going to ask our panel to introduce themselves. We'll start at that end of the couch with Abigail. But I'd also like you to say, not just your relationship to the IRA, but just to start off, what do you think 1 year in its biggest impact has been so far? So,
sure.
Yeah.
So hi, everyone. My name is Abby Hopper. I have the privilege of serving as the president and CEO of SEIA, Solar Energy Industries Association. We're the National Trade Association for the solar and storage industry here in the United States. For our industry, this has been transformational. I know we might talk about some of the challenges, but I want to start with the positive. It has been truly breathtaking, the impact it has had on the industry, a 10-year runway, 10 years of certainty, a 10-year investment tax credit and production tax credit. Never happened before in our industry, and that amount of business certainty has allowed companies to plan, make investment decisions, deploy capital in a way that they never have before. And we're seeing that in some of those statistics that you cited.
Victoria, do you want to weigh in here?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Victoria Mills. I'm a managing director at the Environmental Defense Fund, which is a global nonprofit environmental advocacy group. And I lead our work with businesses to align their policy advocacy with their climate goals. And picking up on what Abby said, I think for us, the big takeaway after a year is that the historic investment of the Inflation Reduction Act is producing historic private investment in clean energy and technology. And just a few updates on those statistics. As of the anniversary, Climate Power put out a report, and the total private investment driven by IRA is $278 billion.
Wow, that's a much bigger number.
Creating 170,000 new jobs in 44 states across the economy. Yeah. So that is pretty magnificent track record for the first year. An example here in New York State, you have General Electric announcing a big investment in its Vernova wind turbine manufacturing plant that created 200 new jobs. You have entire new economies developing, the battery belt across the Midwestern and Southern states. So it's just a tremendous response to the private sector, and it comes from that certainty that you mentioned, Abby.
And Basil, do you want to weigh in here from what you're seeing from the New York perspective?
Sure. I actually had $271 billion. So
the numbers I have to tell you, as someone who looked, and I looked at this a few months ago. The numbers were all over the map. So $7
billion more from yesterday morning.
Okay, good. That's how fast it's going.
Counting.
7
and
billion.
counting. So just update your phones later. Basil Segarra, Commissioner of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, also sit as board member on NYSERDA, State Energy Agency, State's Climate Action Council co-chair as well. So helped to draft the law and now pulling it together here in New York State. So IRA passes. It was a major eureka moment just from our perspective as regulators, as people within state government who are trying to figure out how to put the policies together and actually implement them over the course of a year. And you go back 14 months ago without federal money to the announcement of the IRA. All of a sudden you got CHIPS, the bipartisan infrastructure law, and the IRA, half a trillion dollars, right, over the course of 10 years. Total game changer. So we had been looking simply at our ability to hit our really ambitious climate action targets, right, which are much like the many other states, 80 by 50, and how you decarbonize by that point, and looking at the lack of federal funds,
right,
how much harder that would have been for New Yorkers, for businesses, just for your average taxpayer, it was a total game changer. And we see also the tailwinds created over the course of the last year. You know, the national $271 billion, that impact is being felt here in New York, whether it's the GEs, whether it's 120 major onshore and offshore renewable projects here in New York State. So we actually see the tailwinds. We're seeing it in the numbers. We're seeing it in the interest that's coming into the state in terms of
Can you give us one
projects.
specific example of something that couldn't have happened without this but has happened?
Well, listen, I think the interest in solar in New York State was already very strong. The interest in wind in New York State was already very strong. We were able to apply future IRA dollars to existing projects, and the economics actually work out. Now, mind you, we are still in the early days of the IRA.
We're going to get
right?
to that.
That's important to know. So we're still very much in the planning phase of it, even though there's so much activity nationally. But we see the dollars coming our way, providing some security to capital that's going to be needed to fund these projects. And obviously we're dealing with inflation at the same time, but there's an enormous amount of interest right now.
So I want to say one thing that I can say as specific things that are happening because of the IRA, and that really is around manufacturing, which is a huge part of the IRA that sometimes gets lost. There's a whole effort around domestic manufacturing and reshoring supply chains here in the United States, and there have been, as I think you mentioned it, 51 solar manufacturing facilities, 91 storage manufacturing facilities. Those would not have reshored here to the United States without the IRA and the certainty that's provided in it. They've gone to a number of states across the United States. You know, does every announcement going to get built? Probably not. But I already have been to a number of ribbon cuttings, not just groundbreakings, but ribbon cuttings.
That's amazing. 1 year in and you're going to ribbon cuttings. That's moving fast.
Really amazing. It is moving fast. And so I think that is a specific and a specific example of something that would not have happened but for the investments in the IRA.
So now that we've established that this is a pretty transformational act,
yes,
let's talk about what is also the challenges, because here we are a little bit more than a year in. What worries you when you are down on the ground? Victoria, why don't we start with you and we'll do a circle, but when you're concerned, what are you concerned about?
Sure. For me, the things that we're keeping an eye on fall into three buckets: environment, business, and politics. So, you know, from an environmental perspective, this law is all carrot and no stick. And so in order to get the decarbonization and fulfill the potential of achieving a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, we need to drive complete uptake of these incentives and investments. And that's why we're working so hard, and the whole community is working hard to make sure businesses, not just the ones who are the clean energy producers and the clean tech manufacturers, but the ones on the buy side, the fleets and the renewable energy users and the tech companies and the retailers and the product manufacturers, that they are aware of and actively making the connection between IRA incentives and their ability to meet their net zero goals. So we'll be watching the tons. And so that's the environment bucket. The business bucket it's complicated. It's a big piece of legislation. There are a lot of moving parts. It's tax credits, not grant money, mostly. So you have to do the thing before you get the reward. So in order to demystify some of this and make sure, like, close the awareness gap and demystify it a little bit, EDF and others in the environmental community have created a whole suite of resources. There's iratracker.org that tells you for each incentive, where is it in the process of having guidance released. EDF has an Understanding the Inflation Reduction Act hub that takes common use cases for companies, like, I want to electrify my fleet. What can I use? I want to buy more renewable energy. How can I access the IRA? I want to make my building more energy efficient. So those resources are available. So business challenges, environmental challenges, and political challenges.
Yeah, say no more.
Since day one, this bill, and regrettably it passed with no Republican votes. But despite the fact that a lot of the money and the incentives are going into red states. But it's been under attack. There's been efforts to repeal it as far as appropriations process. There have been efforts to starve the agencies that are in charge with implementing it. Like, that just has to stop. And so the role of businesses here is to let lawmakers know these are popular programs, that you all want to use them, and that you are relying on them to remain competitive and thrive in the clean energy transition.
Terrific. Basil, do you want to go next? You want to say what worries you, keeps you awake at night?
I guess I would echo everything that was just said, and would add a couple things. Certainly, I would emphasize the politics. I mean, that to me is I think one of the biggest risks long term to this program. One of the other risks is the confusion, I think, that could come from the program with the mix of all the state programs. Right? It's already a complicated federal law, and you've got multiple states with different kinds of incentive programs. So how do we harmonize the federal money with, for example, New York State's existing funding programs and not make it cumbersome and burdensome on the ultimate end user, whether it's a company or if it's an individual taking advantage of incentives. So we've been pushing quite aggressively with the federal government to align their programs with ours when we get grant money, for example, into the state, so that we're not having to adjust our programs for federal dollars while having a different program for the state dollars for ultimately the same outcome, which would be a tax incentive or something else.
Yeah.
So I think that certainly is it. And I will be frank, I think one of the biggest things that keeps me up at night is I don't know that it's enough. I don't want to sound greedy, as excited as we are about this incredible federal investment, game changer. I don't think it's enough. So how many states can pony up the amount of money that's needed at the state level? What more can the feds do in the long run? To the carrot versus stick, right? Many of the states have sticks. We need a federal stick as well. And ultimately, you need something that is comprehensive and unique for the entire country, not just enforcement at various state levels.
Interesting. Okay.
I like the way these two think.
Great minds, great minds.
Yeah, well, I live, work, and breathe in Washington, D.C., so I will echo the political aspect and could talk about it nonstop, but I won't. I will, because I think you two covered it well. I would say two things. One is that, you know, it was so exciting to live, work, and breathe in Washington, D.C. when the IRA passed. And go to the White House and celebrate it all. And then the hard work of implementation began. And there's really like nothing less sexy than working on implementation, right? Like going to commenting on proposed guidance documents, like that's not a bumper sticker worthy. So the implementation process and talking with the Department of Treasury and talking about, you know, what does domestic guidance look like and what's a manufactured product, and are bolts like structural, you know, structural or not structural, like it is so weedy and so specific and so critically important. And that gives me great anxiety because it has huge implications for our industry, is incredibly technical, and there's sort of this information gap. So
Can I ask you to be specific on that? Like, what's the kind of technical, weedy thing that people like? I don't want you to put everyone to sleep. I just want you to try to highlight the.
So, like, the goal that most everyone can agree on is that we want to incent the domestic manufacturing of goods here in the United States. The question is sort of what qualifies as a domestic good, and you know, we know it has to be 40% of the product has to be
right. Some
manufactured here.
Battles.
And sort of what qualifies, and like at what point in the product, and what information do you have to give, and is it all of this couch, or is it just the fabric, or is it these guys too? But if you assemble it here, does that count? Or if you do, you know, like you can see how it gets pretty.
Yeah, I've been watching the battles. They're fascinating.
Yeah,
like if China ships the materials here and you assemble it here, does it count?
Does it count? Right. So that gives me a lot of anxiety. The other thing that that is both one of the most exquisitely beautiful things about the IRA is the way in which it embodied what I think is one of our country's most wonderful attributes, which is we actually care about other humans. And there are social justice attributes in the IRA, which really have not been a part of our tax policy, in at least our clean energy tax policy in this way. And so in order to get the foundational investment tax credit, you have to have prevailing wage and you have to have apprenticeship programs. There are adders for low-income communities. There are adders for energy communities. And, you know, it just wasn't a part of the way that energy tax credits have worked in the past. And then we can talk about all the grant programs. I have a lot of anxiety about whether we are ready to live up to that promise and that sort of commitment we have made to environmental justice communities. And surely a lot of good work being done, but I don't know that we're gonna be able to do that. And so—
Is that because there aren't enough people to go into the apprenticeship programs, because we don't know how to do it? Like,
I think there's a lot of reasons. I think sort of depends on the part of the country, right? There's some parts of the country that don't have that infrastructure. There are other parts of the country perhaps where we don't have the right relationships with environmental justice communities, and there's not a history of working together.
So things have been rolling out pretty quickly. Yeah. You anticipate in the future it could slow things down? Because it hasn't stopped it to this point.
Ask me that again.
So it hasn't, the social justice didn't seem to stop the first wave. Are you worried that it slows the second wave? Like,
I'm worried that that we'll sort of go too quickly over, like, you know, speak a little bit too much in broad generalities and not actually be too helpful to communities that are the intended recipients.
I see. So you're not worried it's going to roll the energy rollout. You're worried we just won't meet our social justice commitments that are part of that.
Yeah, and I worry it'll be a little bit of like, we are helping them and not, you know, communities are not being centered at as they should be, right?
I want to get to the opportunities in law, but I do want to ask you one other question as someone who lives and breathes in Washington. I'm a little I mean, this law was designed to eventually win over Republicans. That's what this law was designed to do, and it is in fact going into Republican districts. Is that having any political resonance or not?
On the front page of the newspapers or behind closed doors? I would say yes, behind closed doors. I mean, that's my job and probably all your jobs as well. When I meet one-on-one with Republican lawmakers and remind them that these investments are coming to their districts and impacting their constituents, they are always excited and always enthusiastic. They are not willing to, you know, make big public statements and get on bipartisan legislation, but they're aware and willing to make sort of commitments to me personally and sort of my industry generally, and they're certainly willing to let us hold fundraisers for them. So you know, it's really incumbent upon us to continue to raise the awareness. Like my goal, my professional goal is to make it politically impossible for Republicans to vote against clean energy, because it doesn't make any political or economic sense for them to do so.
Well, let's see how that goes. So here we are. I do want to talk about opportunities. So we've talked about what's happened so far. We've talked about some of the challenges going ahead. What are some of the opportunities that you see that have not yet been realized, or where could we go with this if we had, like, maybe you can tell me what we still need? As you say, we need more federal. So what are the opportunities we're missing, and how do we get there? Let's start with you.
Well, listen, I think the law is big and broad, right? And there's certainly a great deal of opportunity in there. You know, mentioning the environmental justice components of the law. I mean, just to go back to that, I think that is the greatest opportunity. We see that here in New York. Actually, Justice 40 and the IRA to some degree was based on what New York had already been doing. Ali Zaidi, President's climate advisor, was here in New York before he took that job, so helped us to craft some of these policies here. I think you just look at the city, for example, you look at historically disadvantaged areas in New York City. You look at Sunset Park in Brooklyn, right? Typically an area that with the worst air, most burdens, no job activity. Now you see.
Yeah. Why is the rent so high there?
Why is the rent so high? Okay. Yeah, right. You see us now with this federal tool and matched up with state resources, being able to reverse the fortunes of that community. And it's not just the state coming in and doing so; it's in fact the community demanding it and being a part of it. So I think when I look statewide and probably nationwide on this, you look at some of the opportunities to bring disadvantaged communities up out of the conditions that they're in right now and empower them. The IRA, matched with really good state programs, is going to change the way that we operate as a country. So I think, to me, that's the greatest opportunity. It was the win behind the IRA. It was the win behind the state's law. And I think if we don't deliver on that, I think it erodes, the backlash on it will erode the support that we need from the base. And it makes it that much harder for us to go in and say to businesses, hey, this makes sense. Or to Republican communities, hey, it's worth the investment here. Look at all the success we're having in these other areas. So we're holding ourselves in New York to that 40% goal. 40% of our investment will be in those disadvantaged communities. So all of the billions of dollars coming into New York State that are federally governed by that, as well as our state law, which requires it, will help to make our cities, our upstate cities as well, many of which are disadvantaged, Buffalo, Syracuse,
Right.
Rochester, change them and take advantage of the manufacturing regrowth with Micron coming into New York as well. So it's all, in a way, we're trying to tie it all together while we're flying the plane, if you will.
It's a lot. I want to go to you next because I know you have some thoughts on this.
So, coming back to your question, what is the IRA for and what was the goal of it? I think I can't speak to what the White House's goal or Congress's goal from an EDF perspective. Why we got behind the Inflation Reduction Act was that it was the most robust effort in decades that to do something serious about climate change, to reduce emission, that could actually get across the finish line and bring co-benefits for environmental justice, for economic development, for competitiveness for businesses. So that's why we went behind it 100%. So, in terms of what the potential is, I think we're going to continue to see that wave of investment. I mean, estimates are in the $3 trillion of the combined investment, private and public, could transform the economy, really accelerate decarbonization. But there's a big but. That's like, we all have to be a part of this. We have to defend the legislation, make sure the agencies are funded, pass additional policies to make it effective, because it's not the IRA in isolation. You need transmission regulation. You need to get the renewable energy onto the grid. You need permitting reform for clean energy facilities. And so that's just making the IRA work. But then how do you get the rest of the emission reductions you need to stay on the path to 1.5 degrees? Well, you need some sticks, and you need regulations at the federal level on power plants. You need truck emission standards and vehicle emission standards. You need methane regulation, and you need really strong state policies like the Cap and Invest program that's being developed here in New York State. So it's a yes and.
It's a yes and. And I'm going to give you a couple minutes to go before we get to our poll and our questions. So
Sure. So I would certainly add my voice to this idea that the IRA is both transformational and a great starting point, right? And as I think about it, I think about, wow, it is going to transform our economy. And when we think about all of this renewable energy and different ways of fueling our fleet and our industry, we have to do things differently, right? And that means that our grid needs to operate differently, and so we need more transmission, and we need a different way of permitting, and that means we need to fuel our homes differently, and so we need different interconnection policy, and we need to operate our homes like virtual power plants, and we need to have different market rules around how homes can operate as batteries and bid into wholesale markets, right? And so there's a whole group of regulations and policy that are additive to the IRA, right? And they're not all just more financial incentives. They're more kind of policy constructs that allow that to happen. And I think that's an important piece of allowing the system to grow. That does get a little weedy, but it's kind of part of, we're talking about energy. It's hard not to get a little weedy. So I think that's one of the opportunities that happen. And the thing I love about the IRA is that it is big enough to include a bunch of different technologies, right? We haven't even talked about hydrogen, which is, that is a bumper sticker one. Everyone loves to talk about hydrogen, about electric vehicles, right? There's certainly all of these different technologies, all different kind of market segments. Even in mine alone, I'm so I'm so protective of it. Like, residential utility scale. We haven't talked about offshore wind, which is my first true love. But there's all of different kinds of technologies. And so I think that's the other beauty of the IRA and this. But I will hand it back to you so we can get to the questions.
Yeah, well, what we're going to do first is, do we have the poll results? Okay, you want to post those? Okay, so how will IRA implementation most impact your company or industry? Most people say job creation. So job creation's our big winner. Cost savings, nice. Access to capital. No one believes it'll be no impact. Yeah, that's kind of amazing. So everyone agrees that we've got something coming, so that's terrific. Do we want to do a few audience questions? Do you have questions for us?
First one is, the Department of Labor data points to skills gap as a key challenge for successful implementation of IRA-funded infrastructure projects. How can innovative programs or states solve for this problem?
Do you want to take that one? That sounds like a...
Sure, I'll take it quickly. Obviously, we know that there's a skills gap. It's a new industry, a new series of industries in the middle of a transition right now. So I can talk to New York at least.
Yeah.
We put the Department of Labor at the table with us. We brought labor to the table with us when we were crafting the state's climate plan over the course of 2 years. So we know what the skills gaps are. We're investing through the Department of Labor actually to create those training centers and working with labor. Right? Labor has a really important role to play in New York State's plan, at least, to ensure that we're building those jobs of the future and actually bringing those that will be displaced, right, in traditional sectors like oil and gas, into the new economy over the course of the next 10 years.
Okay. Do we want to do another question? We'll have everyone handle one question.
How can we use market forces more?
Well, this sounds like you, Victoria.
How do we use market forces more? I always like to think about how individual action can drive markets. So I would offer 3 calls to action for businesses in the audience. Number 1, use the money. Use the money if you're not already, and if you're still figuring it out, get informed. Use all the resources that are available to make the case internally. Second, defend the Inflation Reduction Act. Let your members of Congress know why this is strategic and important for your business, and tell your stories publicly. And then the third is advocate for the other policies needed to make the market drive decarbonization. And that's all of the ones that I mentioned, plus an economy-wide price on carbon.
And do we have another question? No?
Yeah.
Okay, did you want to answer that question too on market forces?
So one of the so we have a research department, and one of the interesting pieces of research we do every year is look at corporates that choose to go solar. Not surprisingly, it's gone up every year. And also, to me, not surprising, it's mostly because of price, right? Every consumer, and when I say consumer, I'm speaking of utilities, corporates, and residential consumers, are all going solar because they're saving money, right? And utilities are going renewable because they're saving money. The North Indiana cooperative is not going solar because they've suddenly found environmentalism. They're putting out renewable RFPs because they are saving money. And so, when I hear questions like, how do we use the market better? It is really, how do we educate that you're going to save money if you make these choices? So that's the answer that I would give. And so I agree with you. And then once you add on, we didn't talk about this at all, but one of the pretty significant changes in the IRA is that there is a direct pay option that has happened for the MUSH. I love this term, the MUSH market. Municipalities, and I forget what all the MUSH stands for.
Municipal, university, something, and hospital.
Yeah, schools and hospitals, right? So that whole sector and nonprofits that used to not be able to use tax credits because they don't have tax liability, they are now able to literally get direct money back from the IRS when they make these investments. That is a totally untapped market. And so there's a total unaddressed
customers. is a great subject.
Yeah.
But I want to thank our panel because our time is up. But I think you were all very informative, and I want to really thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Kara Hogensen, Senior Vice President and Head of Workplace Benefits for Benefits and Protection at Principal Financial Group, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Ramona Rupnarine.
Hi, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well, having a great morning. I am Ramona Rupnarine, Global Head of Brand and Recruitment Marketing here at Bloomberg LP, and I'm joined today by Kara Hogensen, Senior Vice President and Head of Workplace Benefits for Benefits and Protection at Principal Financial Group.
And our time is up.
And
that title.
You do a lot. So welcome, Kara.
Thank you very much. Pleased to be here.
Happy you're here. Let's get right to it. What does leading with purpose look like at Principal?
So at Principal Financial Group, our purpose is to help more individuals, businesses, and communities have access to financial security. And we do this really in three primary ways. First of all is through the products and services, the tools and education that we provide. The second is that we are investing in programs and partnerships that create economic pathways for greater financial inclusion. And last but certainly not least is the ongoing research and insights that we invest in as well to ensure that we have a really good understanding of what is working and what isn't working so that we can do our part to advance financial inclusion. In my role at Principal, I have the pleasure of leading our workplace benefits business, and we really focus on serving the needs of small and mid-sized businesses here in the United States. So think those employers that have less than 500 employees. Those employers, their benefit programs are really important to help attract and retain the talent that they need for their ongoing business and the growth that they want to achieve. Benefits like health insurance and income protection and the like. And so we really focus on making sure we're meeting their needs and we understand what those needs are. One of our commitments is to double the number of women-owned and people of color-owned small businesses that we support over a 5-year period of time. The SMB market is underserved here in the United States. We think it's a great opportunity and we want to do our part to help advance that market. The last thing I would just comment on is new research that we just launched this week. So last year, for the first time, we released what's called the Global Financial Inclusion Index. And this year is our second release of information on that topic. And really, it's meant to be a data-driven benchmark to help evaluate financial inclusion in 42 markets around the world. And I think we'll spend a couple more minutes talking about that here.
Yeah, really informative. What role does financial security play in building a more sustainable and inclusive, really, future?
So that question, Ramona, is really at the heart of why we established the Global Financial Inclusion Index. And it's our belief that, with greater financial inclusion, we ultimately can help drive greater security. And with greater security, we'll have a more productive and stronger economy. And so the structure of this index, it really takes a look at 3 different pillars in 42 markets around the world. So the role of the government in those markets, the role of the financial system in those markets, and the role of employers in those markets. And aggregates all of that information, taking a look at, how accessible are financial tools and support? Are those tools and support and products delivered in an ethical and responsible way? And so, we've developed this benchmark, and then we've also taken the next step to compare that benchmark against other data that is indicative of social and economic progress. And what we see is this benchmark and those other data sets are positively correlated. So we think that ultimately this index, financial inclusion as a component, really leads to stronger economies. It leads to greater resilience, whether that be from climate shocks or geopolitical shocks, and that ultimately it does lead to happier citizens and those that are more food secure.
Awesome. Seems like you have a really good roadmap, but what are some of the key sort of barriers or factors in impacting financial inclusion?
So first I'll start with, the markets that are performing the best are the ones where all three of those pillars, the government, the financial system, and employers, are all pulling their weight. And probably no surprise to anyone sitting here today, developed markets fare better on the index than emerging markets. But what has been interesting with the release of this year's information is those markets that are making the fastest progress on financial inclusion are those that are investing in digitally enabling access and education around financial tools. And so that is coming through loud and clear. We also, just focusing on the US for a second, the role of employers in the private market can't be focused on enough. Businesses are the most trusted institution. We look to employers for access to health insurance, to protection products like income protection through disability, to life insurance, to retirement savings vehicles. Employees trust their employers. We need to make sure that we continue to lean into that in order to make sure that there are a greater number of individuals that do have access to the financial solutions that will help them ultimately move towards financial security.
Amazing. So how could businesses and organizations like the folks in the room here today help really advance financial inclusion as part of their ESG efforts?
Absolutely. So back to this employer-employee relationship, a couple of stats. In last year's data, as we looked at the Global Financial Inclusion Index, the U.S. consumer sentiment component of that ranked employers as the top pillar for financial inclusion. This year's data on a global basis, 72% of our global respondents said that they believe their employers act in an ethical and accountable way, or I should say a helpful way. And so it leads us to believe that ultimately, if employers are the mechanism through which individuals can gain access to the resources they need to make progress towards financial security, that those employees will act based on the level of trust that they have in their employer. This goes beyond a paycheck. It is about the benefits program. It's about the environment in which they work. And this is particularly important during times of economic uncertainty. So, part of Principal's commitment is to make sure that we understand the needs of these employers, the needs that their employees have, and ensure that we're delivering the right options for the business and the employees working in that business so that they can ultimately, again, make progress on financial inclusion and security.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the importance is clearly super critical, and there are also barriers, as you mentioned before. So what steps can employers take to really broaden that access and sort of take hold of their important pillar and sort of moment in this and overcome those barriers?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we find in our research, particularly with small and mid-sized businesses, is that they often significantly think 5 times would be what our research would indicate, 5 times overestimate the cost of what benefits would actually have the impact that they would have on that bottom line for that employer. So we need to do a better job of helping educate the decision makers at these businesses around how accessible these types of solutions are. And it's not just about the actual solution itself. It is also about making sure that the right support and education is in place so that the individuals at that workplace understand when it makes sense to make a decision, how they should go about evaluating that decision, and when it may make sense for them to make a change. So it really is about starting with that education and then driving that towards action.
Really, really helpful information today. Thank you for joining us for Principal's Advisory Board session and teaching us all how we can continue to lead with purpose. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. So we have a quick networking break for 30 minutes. It's just going to be outside of these doors. And we have a couple of things I just want to tell you about that we have set up out there if you're interested in participating. One is a Road to COP table. I will be there along with a couple of my colleagues. If you're going to be in Dubai or you have colleagues that will be in Dubai, just come stop by and we can pitch me topics or speakers or ideas of things you'd like us to cover, or just make sure that you get invited to those events. And then the other one is our Growing Your Career in Sustainability table. You can stop by. We have some executives from TerraDo there that can help you with some career advice and just talk about general career in sustainability things. So please join that, and we'll be back here on this back in here again at 11:30. So we'll see you then.
Sometimes all those dark days, but they try to find me, but that's when I lean on you. Whatever happens, my trouble's behind me, 'cause your love's gonna see me through. Nothing can bring me down, I feel you reaching now. You're pulling me back when I'm about to reach the edge. You found me all messed up, you found me down on my luck, so lost. But then I woke up in love when I was chasing highs. You went and saved my life, you picked me up. Thank God I woke up in love with you. Thought I was lost, but then I woke up in love with you. Thought I was lost, but then I woke up in love. 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 You found me all messed up. You found me down on my luck, so lost. But then I woke up in love when I was chasing highs. You went and saved my life. You picked me up. Thank God I woke up in love with you. Thought I was lost, but then I woke up in love with you. Thought I was lost, but then I woke up in love.
Should I do it on the phone? Should I leave a little note in the pocket of his coat? Yeah, maybe I'll just disappear. I don't wanna see a tear, and the weekend's almost here. I'm picking out this dress, trying on these shoes, 'cause I'll be single soon. I'll be single soon. I know he'll be a mess when I break the news, but I'll be single soon. I'll be single soon. I'ma take who I wanna, stay up late if I wanna. I'ma do what I wanna do. I'm picking out this dress, trying on these shoes, 'cause I'll be single soon. I'll be single soon. I know I'm a little high maintenance, but I'm worth a try. Might not give a reason why. Oh well. We both had a lot of fun. Time to find another one. Blame it on feeling young. I'm picking out this dress, trying on these shoes, 'cause I'll be single soon. I'll be single soon. I know he'll be a mess when I break the news, but I'll be single soon. I'll be single soon. I'ma take who I wanna, stay up late if I wanna. I'ma do what I wanna do.
Something's got a hold on me lately. No, I don't know myself anymore. Feels like the walls are all closing in, and the devil's knocking at my door. Whoa, out of my mind. How many times did I tell you I'm no good at being alone? Yeah, it's taking a toll on me. Trying my best to keep from tearing the skin off my bones. Don't you know I lose control when you're not next to me? I'm falling apart right in front of you. Can't you see? I lose control when you're not next to me. Yeah, you're breaking my heart, baby. You make a mess of me. Problematic. Problem is I want your body like I feel like a bad habit. Bad habits hard to break when I'm with you. Yeah, I know I can do it on my own, but I want that real full moon, black magic, and it takes two. Problematic. Problem is when I'm with you, I'm an addict, and I need some relief. My skin and your teeth can't see the forest through the trees. Got me down on my knees, darling, please. Oh, I lose control when you're not next to me. I'm falling apart right in front of you. Can't you see? I lose control when you're not next to me. Yeah, you're breaking my heart, baby. You make a mess of me. I lose control when you're not here with me. I'm falling apart right in front of you. Can't you see? I lose control when you're not here with me. Yeah, you're breaking my heart, baby. You make a mess of me.
The day began like all the rest, a frantic beating in my chest, a panicked reeling in my brain, perspective lost but nothing gained. I wish I was stuck inside my shell. Then the ground began to sway. I realized what mattered most to me. When the stars began to fall right out of the sky and the seas were rising up, I had one thing in mind. It was you, it was you, it was you. It was you, it was you, it was you. When the road began to crumble in front of my eyes, there was only one person I wanted to find. It was you, it was you, it was you. It was you, it was you, it was you, darling. Hey.
when the stars began to fall right out of the sky and the seas were rising up. I had one thing in mind. It was you, it was you, it was you. It was you, it was you, it was you. When the road began to crumble in front of my eyes, there was only one person I wanted to find. It was you, it was you, it was you. It was you, it was you, it was you, darling. When the stars began to fall right out of the sky and the seas were rising up, I had one thing in mind. It was you, it was you, it was you. It was you, it was you, it was you. When the road began to crumble in front of my eyes, there was only one person I wanted to find. It was you, it was you, it was you. It was you, it was you, it was you, darling. It was you, it was you, it was you, darling. It was you, it was you, it was you.
I'll smile, I know what it takes to fool this town. I'll do it till the sun goes down and all through the night time. Oh yeah, oh yeah, I'll tell you what you wanna hear. Keep my sunglasses on while I shed a tear. It's never the right time. Yeah, yeah. I put my arm around so you how strong I am. I put my arm around, I'll show you that I am. I'm unstoppable. I'm a Porsche with no brakes. I'm invincible. Yeah, I win every single game. I'm so powerful. I don't need batteries today. I'm so confident. Yeah, I'm unstoppable today. Unstoppable today. Unstoppable today. Unstoppable today. Yeah, I'm unstoppable today. Break down, only alone I will cry out now. You'll never see what's hiding out deep down. Yeah, yeah. I know, I've heard that to let your feelings show is the only way to make friendships grow, but I'm too afraid now. Yeah, yeah. I put my arm around so you how strong I am. I put my arm around, I'll show you that.
The program will begin in 10 minutes.
I'm a Porsche with no brakes. I'm invincible. Yeah, I win every single game. I'm so powerful. I don't need batteries today. I'm so confident. Yeah, I'm unstoppable today. Unstoppable today. Unstoppable today. Unstoppable today. found a dream that can't be sold. We were right till we weren't. Built a home and watched it burn. I didn't want to leave you, I didn't want to lie. Started to cry, but then remembered I can buy myself flowers, write my name in the sand, talk to myself for hours, see things you don't understand. I can take myself dancing, and I can hold my own head. Yeah, I can love me better than you can. Can love me better, I can love me better, baby. Can love me better, I can love me better. Paint my nails cherry red, match the roses that you laid. No remorse, no regret. I forgive every word you say. Ooh, I didn't want to leave, baby. I didn't want to fight. Started to cry, but then remembered I can buy myself flowers, write my name in the sand, talk to myself for hours, yeah, say things you don't understand. I can take myself dancing, yeah, I can hold my own head, yeah, I can love me better than you can. Can love me better, I can love me better, baby. Can love me better, I can love me better, baby. Can love me better, I can love me better, baby. Can love me better, I didn't want to leave you, I didn't want to fight. Started to cry, but then remembered I can buy myself flowers, write my name in the sand, talk to myself for hours, say things you don't understand. I can take myself dancing, yeah, I can hold my
Please take your seats. The program will begin in 5 minutes.
can love me better than you can.
I would just fly away. And I always knew I couldn't stay. So I had a dream that I'd just fly away. I've been on my own for a minute. Is it only me out there? Searching for the place to begin it. Is it me? Is it you? Is it fear? Standing on the line I was given. People stare and ask me why I'm here. No one seems to think that I fit in, but I don't wanna be like them. No, 'cause I don't wanna be like them. 'Cause I know that I had a dream that someday I would just fly away. And I always knew I couldn't stay. So I had a dream that I'd just fly away, away. I fly away. No one knew how low I was feeling. I was scared to reach for it all, knowing I was here for a reason. But I was scared that if I tried, I'd fall. So where do I go now that I'm in it? I never thought it'd be like this. Dreamed it all my life and I did it. Thought the grass was greener than it is. 'Cause I had a dream that someday I would just fly away. And I always knew I couldn't stay. So I
Take me home tonight, kiss me how you like. I've been waiting for you. I know you ain't shy, well neither am I. What you waiting for, yeah? There's no escaping your ghost of love. There ain't a drink that's strong enough. So I'll close my eyes, kiss you how I like. I've been waiting for you. You're my favorite kind of high, rushing through me like a fire, and I need you to know. I say I won't, but I do. When it comes to loving you, I don't have no control.
Please take your seats. The program is about to begin. Please welcome to the stage Keelin Evans, Vice President of Sustainability at Macy's, and Angela Santos, Customs Practice Leader at Arent Fox Schiff, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Ritika Gupta.
Good morning, everyone. Let's get straight into it. But first, we do have a live polling question for you all. So you can submit your answers throughout the panel. And there will also be a Q&A at the end. So please do save up your questions. So this polling, you should be able to see a barcode that you can scan. Now, the question is, do you think consumers are willing to pay higher prices to ensure that their products are sourced and manufactured ethically? Yes, no, or depends on the product. Well, let's start right there. And Keelin, I'm going to come to you on that. Do you get at Macy's, how much demand is there from customers saying, we want our products sourced more ethically? And, you know, when it comes to labor and human rights, and are they willing to pay more for that?
So when we think about sustainability at Macy's, we're really working to embed that throughout our entire value chain and our entire corporation, because we're really seeing how the customers are expecting companies, what role we need to play in terms of driving sustainability, in terms of driving a more diverse future. And so it is definitely something that grounds why we're doing the work we're doing. And when we really dig into our priorities around sustainability, it is caring for the people, making our products, and managing our environmental impact. So we are trying to do that work to engage the customer or show up for the customer. And particularly on the product space, as a retailer, we need to build trust with the consumer. And so a lot of it comes down to how are we identifying product to be quote unquote sustainable, and really leaning on third-party certifiers who can help us understand, is it the materials, how it was made, is it, hey, there was a worker well-being program in the factory where this was made, so there's something else for the person. And so how do we bring the customer along so that we can show them the breadth of product that is quote unquote sustainable and educate them at the same time?
And how are you embedding sustainability and transparency throughout your supply chains and your operations? And how are you making sure that your supply chain models don't, in fact, widen inequality?
Definitely. We have a history of building upon social compliance audits within the factories that are making our private brand products. And so what that means is, how do we partner with the factories? How do we ensure workers have safe working conditions, paid fairly, treated well? If you find an issue, partnering, driving remediation, actually working on continuous improvement to really show how much we care for the workers. And so a lot of what we've been doing is, how do we get more transparent about the work we are doing? How can we share that with our stakeholders so they understand, you know, we're really serious about this as a priority, and so that it can come through.
And how do you actually measure the progress in some of your initiatives?
A lot of KPIs. So actually data is so critical to the work that we're doing. And when it comes to a social compliance audit, it's actually not, a pass or fail. It's what is the issue? Did we drive to a remediation that we feel actually had a positive outcome? Or are we continue to work with that factory? And so it kind of depends upon the ambition and what we're tracking. I think the other thing that we've been very excited about as we think about having a positive impact on the workers in our supply chain, specifically those in the manufacturing facilities, is can we invest in these worker well-being programs, which are really around personal health care, personal finance. How do they save? How do they open a bank account? How do they take care of their families? And what we're seeing is actually the places where we've launched these programs in partnership with an organization called RISE is that it can drive retention. It can drive productivity. The worker actually has a more positive experience, and so it actually can have a direct impact to the business. And so that's something that we're really excited how partners are helping us get access to that data so we can really connect the dots between actually caring for the person making our products and that it actually has a positive business impact as well.
And Angela, I want to bring you here on the legal side of it, because of course you work with companies and you help them comply with regulations, especially when it comes to forced labor and human rights. And also, you're helping companies get goods into the, helping companies get goods into the country, minimizing some of the, duties and dealing with detentions at the border. So talk to us about just a couple briefly of the top challenges that companies face and how you help them work around that.
Sure. So one of the largest challenges that companies that I'm working with are facing right now is the customs forced labor ban. So the United States bans the importation of goods produced with forced labor. Starting last year, they started enforcing the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, which means all goods that are produced in whole or part in the Uyghur region of China are banned from importation into the United States. The problem here is that companies don't know if their goods are produced with these problematic materials, and they'll get stopped at the border, and then they don't know how to get them back in. So in order to get goods released by customs, they have to produce all these, this chain of custody documentation from start to finish, from their first tier supplier all the way to the finished goods. That can be extremely problematic because there are middlemen, there are several tiers. A supply chain can have thousands of suppliers. So companies are really struggling with getting the documentation that they need to get goods released from the border. And that can be very expensive for a company, and it can happen unexpectedly.
And how do you navigate laws or new laws that differ from country to country and I imagine are frequently updated? I imagine that is quite tough for companies to keep track of.
It's very difficult. Many of our clients are multinational companies. They want to be compliant in every country where they do business, and that is their goal. And so they don't want different policies and procedures in every single country. The United States is really taking the lead in terms of forced labor enforcement, but other countries like Canada, the UK have supply chain diligence reporting requirements. So what most companies we've seen do, and how we advise them, is if you don't want different policies for every jurisdiction, you're going to want to build your policies around the most stringent laws. That way that you can implement it throughout your organization, there isn't confusion in different jurisdictions, and people can comply.
And Keelin, a lot of your business might be domestic, but is that something that Macy's faces as a challenge, even just differing laws from state to state?
Definitely. And that is a really interesting part of what we do and why I love my legal partners, because they help us understand that. They help us, again, build a compliance program that goes for the highest bar. And then we can challenge ourselves too of, do we want to stop there? And I think that that's what is exciting for a company like us, where we're very much domestic focused. We watch what the EU is doing, because it could come here. And so how do we partner? How do we partner with our legal team to get more educated, to understand, okay, where do we need to start planning ahead so that we're not caught off guard?
And Angela, on that, how do you increase transparency? I mean, you brought up the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which came into effect last year. We saw millions of dollars of shipments detained at the border, and in many instances, companies perhaps don't even know, that their supply chain may be tainted. So how do you increase that transparency?
Really, companies have to be proactive. They need to do a risk mitigation strategy. So they have to take a look at their supply chain, look at where they're doing business. If they don't know already, they need to know where their suppliers are located. And that can be a huge task for companies. So I would take a risk-based approach. And you need management and C-suite support in order to do this. The lower level clerks, et cetera, might not be able to have the power and resources to do that. But if management gives the resources and the capability to do this, and they're able to really do this supply chain due diligence and build policies and procedures to due diligence ahead of time to avoid a detention.
So you mentioned sort of getting in ahead of it with these kind of risk mitigation strategies, but how can you mitigate that risk of forced labor in their supply chains?
Sure, there's a few things. You could have a code of conduct that prohibits the use of forced labor in your supply chain. You should require your suppliers to also follow that code of conduct. You should do supply chain due diligence, doing a risk-based approach, and that may require technology. There are a number of suppliers that have popped up in the last couple of years to address these risks, and you may need to use them because it's very difficult to do a manual supply chain review. Also, you should train your suppliers and also your employees to be on the lookout for this. Build an ethical supply chain. Make sure that you know and take accountability for your supply chain.
Can you actually quantify when it comes to supply chain disruptions in the kind of labor aspect of how much that could actually cost a company? I understand it would vary from industry to industry, but maybe roughly?
Sure. And this really depends by industry, like you said. Historically, the United States has been focused on solar, agricultural goods like tomatoes, and cotton and apparel. And in those industries, there have been millions of dollars of worth of goods detained. Since the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act was implemented last year, about 5,000 shipments have been detained, valued at about $2 billion. Customs is ramping up enforcement, so we expect that next year it's going to be much, much more than that. It's hard to quantify per company. Some companies have been really drastically impacted by this, getting shipment after shipment after shipment detained. Others just haven't, even in the same industry. So it's hard to predict per company, but it's certainly a risk for many companies.
And on that, from the financial side, if you, either of you, speaking to investors, when you speak to them, how much of a risk is ESG in complying with regulations, and what is kind of the biggest concern from an investor's point of view? Is there a financial case really to be made for this?
I think when you think about any of your stakeholders, but particularly your investors, it all comes down to materiality. What is most material to your business within the whole landscape of ESG? And really making sure not only is your proactiveness, but your fundamental strategy on sustainability, it has to be crafted around your business, what matters to your stakeholders, your customers. What is your business strategy? What are your financial goals? Connect those dots. That allows you to have a much better conversation with your investors and really meet what they're hoping to see from you, because they want to see financial performance, but they also want to make sure you're mitigating all your risk, whether it's climate risk, social risk, governance risk. And so how do you really connect those dots? And I think that's what we really try to do when we listen to our investors or we listen to our customers, because they're just as important to us, to really bring a holistic strategy together of how we're approaching it.
And I completely agree with you. I've spoken with boards, with investors, with funds, because they are concerned about these new laws. They want to know how that may impact their profitability for the year, what the risks are, whether they should invest in certain companies or in certain industries. So there is an impact. ESG really has a financial impact on companies now.
And thinking about the future and the role of technology. Of course, the buzzword everyone's talking at the moment is AI, but even more broadly, what do you think technology can really bring to the table to perhaps provide a solution? That's to both of you.
I think for us, it really starts with, do you have the data in the right place, or do you have KPIs? And so we really try and ground ourselves across any ambition that we have in sustainability on, okay, how are we going to measure progress there? And then are we going to get the data? How are we going to get the data? So even this past year, a lot of our work has been with our data analytics and our data governance team. Okay, are we setting up the structures internally so that we know where this data will live within our systems? How do we pull it together? Because then you can actually empower the teams on great decision making. And that's where it comes back to this idea of how do you actually embed sustainability throughout your organization? Well, you have to give them the right data so they can make the right decisions. They can actually say, oh, we are making progress, or there's risk here, or wow, that actually informs material risk, financial risk, and they're connecting the dots themselves. So it's not all just the sustainability practitioner. It's actually with also the people in the business.
And Angela, can AI provide any sort of solution?
I'm starting to see that AI and technology generally is becoming more and more important in the area that I work in. U.S. Customs and Border Protection is using it to target shipments for detention. And on the flip side, importers are using it in order to help better inform them in terms of their supply chains. Because as I said before, companies are having problems with tracing their entire supply chains just because of the sheer number of suppliers that might be in their supply chain. So there are a number of AI suppliers that have really started up in the last few years that help companies with tracing their supply chains. They use public data, government data, manifest data, bills of ladings to really trace goods from start to finish. And it's not perfect. There is no silver bullet. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. But AI can help you at least identify risks and see connections where you may not have seen them before. On the other end, there's also one of the largest areas of detention has been apparel based on cotton from the Uyghur region. And there is this new technology that allows for isotopic testing of garments. So you're able to tell by testing a shirt where the cotton came from, which is pretty impressive. And that might extend to other commodities. I hope it extends to other commodities in the future because it would help me a lot.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. Keelin, in terms of your current initiatives, how can you build on those, your current sustainability initiatives, and what could Macy's be doing better or improve on?
I think what we really ground ourselves in is retail is a team sport, sustainability is a team sport. There's nothing we can do alone. And that's really how we approach our initiatives and approach the idea of getting better. So it's not just working with internal stakeholders, it's brands, it's suppliers, it's nonprofits. And I think that's what actually has been very exciting for us is engaging with some amazing nonprofits who are doing amazing work, whether on the social side, the environmental, or the connections where actually if you have a positive environmental impact, you can have a positive social impact. And how does that help further our ambitions? So in this past year, we actually engaged with World Wildlife Federation on some goals for water usage, particularly in areas of high water risk, so areas with high droughts or there's water contamination. So how are we going to have an immediate impact on that? It's going to have an impact on the communities. It's going to have an impact on the people who are working within our supply chain. And so that gets us really excited of how can we keep going further on things like that.
And how can you embed this culture of sustainability and thinking about human rights throughout the organization from kind of top to bottom so that it is this topmost priority?
We're really excited. Last year, we announced a social purpose called Mission Everyone at Macy's, and it's really grounded in 3 pillars of people, so really our diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, and we have a long history of advocating for diversity, equity, and inclusion, both internally and externally. Our community work, so really our corporate giving, our grant giving, working with nonprofits, and then Planet, so really my team around sustainability. What's exciting with Mission Everyone is it's really about, are you building the tools and the frameworks to help decision making within the organization? The other thing we kicked off this year is we have launched sustainability ambassadors. And what they are is actually every chief executive within the company has identified 1 to 2 people to represent their function, to work with my team, which is kind of our Sustainability Center of Excellence. They are responsible for helping us build out what are these initiatives, what are the programs, how are we going to measure them, how are we going to get the work done, so that the responsibility starts to transition into the business and that they're empowered to help us do this work together. And I think that that's been really rewarding and really exciting for us to see that start to come together.
And Angela, if you could weigh in here, when you work with companies, what do you say kind of the top things that they're doing that work, that maybe don't work, that they could be doing more of?
I think to your point, it's exactly right that it has to become a culture, a culture that is pro-sustainability from the top down and throughout. And we're seeing it more and more because customers want this, investors want this. So if it becomes ingrained in the company, it becomes something that everyone strives for. And then it's not just a matter of cost, because of course there is a cost to sustainability. I know that you might not get the cheapest costs, or your materials may not be as inexpensive because they use less water or they're sustainably sourced, but it's important to people, and if it's important to a company, they'll make that investment.
Wonderful. Well, we are running out of time a little bit, but thank you both for your insights. And I'd like to go back to the live polling question. I'm wondering if we can get the results on the board here that we can see. It was, do you think consumers are willing to pay higher prices to ensure products are sourced and manufactured ethically? And you can see on the board there, yes, seems like 27%. Depends on the product, 57%. And no there as well. But thank you so much. I think we have some Q&A now, and Meg is going to lead that for us.
Great. First one is back to the technology question. Any thoughts on blockchain and how blockchain can be used?
I'm definitely not an expert on that. I think it just continues to show that there are ways where you can connect, and we require a lot of innovation continuing to happen in the space. And that's where I say it's a team sport. You know, we might not be able to solve it ourselves. So who are the partners who can go really help us understand the technology options, and how do you bring together things like AI, blockchain? There's really smart things out there. Help us bring those together to provide solutions to those within the industry.
Wonderful. Next one is, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no. I think blockchain would be helpful, but there has to be an infrastructure in place because that requires every part of the supply chain to have the technology for those digital IDs, et cetera. So will your cotton mill have that? Will the farmers have that? How do you trace that? So an infrastructure has to be implemented so that that can be successful.
So what does Macy's do for responsible disposing of waste?
So we were really focused on this and have an ambition to actually divert 80% of our waste from our direct operations from landfill. So we were actively working on this. And when you think about our operations really domestically, one of our major focuses this year has been around cardboard. Think about it. How many cartons of goods, how do they arrive to our supply chain, how do they arrive to our locations? And then how do we make sure we're actually using technology to help us understand how much of our cardboard coming in is then actually going out to a recycler? And so it's been really exciting to have reporting and the ability to use actually RFID tagging to help us actually weigh how much cardboard are we taking out of the stores to send to a recycler so that we can identify where we have opportunities and processes and gaps in knowledge and awareness so that we can create the right programs to continue to drive that. So it's actually quite exciting to see, again, how technology is helping support even waste reduction goals.
One other for you, sorry to I'm grilling you. Have you stopped selling, has Macy's stopped selling certain products or brands based on concerns around supply chain?
No, not that it comes to mind. I'd say the way that we approach any risk within our supply chain is actually how we approach social compliance. And what I mean by that is, how do we drive continuous improvement? We'd rather continue to engage with a partner, use our influence, drive for a better solution, and see what maybe is the issue behind any of the risk or issues that we've identified. So our goal is not to go into say a factory and find an issue and then walk away. Our goal is to actually use our influence to drive for improvements. Because if we walk away, the problem hasn't been fixed. And so it's better for us, and this is actually where some of our nonprofit partners have helped us understand this, or we leverage partnerships so that we can actually drive towards a better outcome versus walking away.
How frequent must an organization conduct audits to certify the ethical you know the word I'm trying to say, of the efficiency of their supply chain? Sorry about that. And how much is dependent on accurate reporting?
So every company, again, defines their social compliance program. So I can only speak to what we do here at Macy's and how we're approaching it. So when we look at the products that make or the suppliers who are making our private brand products managed by our sourcing teams, we do social compliance audits on every 12 to 18 months. And it really depends upon prior results. So if your prior results were really excellent and we don't believe you have high risk and we think you also have a code of conduct, you have standards that are high, we might audit you more towards the 18 months. Or we might just continue to come in once a year. So it is a regular, ongoing process, not one that it's one and done. It's definitely constant.
Yeah. And I think it depends on risk, where the supplier is located, like you said, what you've seen in the past. Are there labor issues that you've seen? If they're located in certain places, they might be at higher risk than, let's say, Canada. So it really depends. Companies have limited resources. They can't audit every month. They can't audit every 6 months. So it's a really risk-based approach, as you said.
I'll get one for you because your turn. How do you get C-suite, and I guess this is really for both of you, but how do you get C-suite to buy in on pushing for a more ethical supply chain?
I think you tell them that it impacts their bottom line and give them a risk assessment. So some commodities are more at risk than others, let's say solar or cotton or any of these commodities that have been specifically named by the DHS task force or customs. Those are probably more at risk, and the C-suite should be aware if they're not doing something now, they should be taking proactive steps. But generally, I think give them an awareness of the landscape, the legal landscape now, and how this could benefit their company. It's better to spend a few dollars, spend a little bit of time now, than deal with a detention that's very expensive and time-consuming later.
One last one that seems like a good one to end on. What are your thoughts on the poll results?
I agree.
I agree. Yeah.
Thank you, Meg. And thank you, I mean, I think we could have talked for a whole lot longer on that, so thank you both for your very insightful views there. So I want to thank Keelin Evans of Macy's and Angela Santos of Orange Fox. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Shaheen Contractor, ESG Research Analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. Thank you for joining. So today we're going to take a deep dive into ESG funds, so my favorite topic. And we're going to use assets and flows to paint a little picture of market direction, sort of answer the question, is money still going to ESG? Where is it going? And then we're going to look at companies most held in ESG funds and what that tells us about managers' preferences. So in other words, is it the E that people care about? Is it the S or the G that really matters to fund inclusion? Now, before I dig in, just maybe a quick introduction. So I cover ESG for Bloomberg Intelligence, which is Bloomberg's research team. So I describe my job as sort of taking Bloomberg's ESG data and providing analysis into it. So writing about trends, drivers, and climate, gender, and basically how our clients can use this data when they're making decisions. So let's dig straight in. Over here, we see assets for ESG ETFs. Now, first, this is ETFs, so exchange-traded funds, or one slice of the fund pie. But I think in terms of trajectory, in terms of growth, risks, and opportunities, this is pretty indicative of the market overall, just the trajectory. Now, what you'll see here is that assets have reached about $500 billion globally. You can see that the orange bar, or the US, is about 25% of global assets, approximately. So it's very clear that the dominant player is really Europe, which is pretty much the rest, like the white bar. And we think that dominance of Europe is only going to continue. Now, assets is comprised of really market appreciation and also flows. So a lot of this trend is actually driven by market appreciation. You can see sort of the bull markets from 2015 to 2021, and then a bit of a slowdown. And I think a better sort of indication of market sentiment is just flows. So in other words, just inflows and outflows from ESG funds. And that's what you see in this next slide over here. So you can see that flows sort of, they peaked in about 2021. A lot of it was driven by clean energy, actually, which has sort of come down off its highs. What's interesting, though, again, is that the yellow bar, which is the US, if you look at 1H 2023, that's gone into negative territory for one of the first times, actually probably the first time. Now, how many people think that that negative flows is the backlash in the US? Just a quick raise of hands. Okay, not too many. I don't think it's really the backlash. So if we look at what really drove those outflows, it's one fund. One fund saw $7 billion in outflows, and that's it. I mean, other funds saw outflows, but that is largely driven by one fund. And that, to me, points to concentration risk. It's not like there's this mass uprising where multiple funds are selling ESG, right? It's really one fund. And the challenge there is that assets have grown historically due to these large allocations from a couple of investors, making us very dependent on a handful of investors and a handful of funds. And when something like this happens, one flow comes out of one fund, it just ends up being very noticeable. So again, not this mass uprising against ESG, it's really just one fund. And I'll just throw out another statistic. So the US ESG ETF asset base, 30% of it is held by 11 investors. So when you're dependent on 11 investors on their whims and fancies, you face a lot of concentration risk. So what we really need today is a wider investor base. We need to move beyond just those 11 investors to retail or to other investor classes. And that's where I think the backlash is going to come in and challenge things. In other words, we're going to create a pause or sort of a challenge in the widening of that investor base because people are now, they're just scared of investing in ESG. So that's really my view, that these negative flows is not really driven by some kind of backlash, but the backlash is going to stop the sort of the more positive flows from coming in, widening of the investor base. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about companies most and least held by ESG funds. And the reason we did this is because everybody knows that when it comes to ESG ratings, they differ. So what we did is we looked at companies most held in ESG funds. In other words, what companies are the most preferred according to fund managers, according to fund managers' highest convictions. So to the left, you can see our high conviction portfolio, in other words, companies most preferred. And to the right, you can see our exclusions, or in other words, companies that make it to none of the ESG funds that we analyzed. Just a quick word on methodology. So we took the 15 largest ESG funds in the US, and we looked at how frequently is a company held and how overweight is it held in these funds to define that conviction score, which really sort of defines high conviction versus low conviction. It ranges from 0 to 2, with 2 being better. The one thing you'll notice here is that a high conviction portfolio, so the one to the, that's my right, yep, the one to the right, a lot of it is driven by resource-light sectors, right? Technology, financials, healthcare. And that tells me that ESG investors tend to prefer resource-light sectors. To the right, if you look at our exclusions portfolio, you'll see a lot of the resource-intensive sectors. You'll see utilities. In fact, about 66% of the S&P utility constituents are in no ESG fund we analyzed. Now, if you roll this up and you look at just the average relative weighting to the S&P, you see exactly the same thing. Information technology is about 2% overweight, energy about 3% underweight, and utilities underweight again. Now, that to me tells me that ESG investors tend to prefer resource-light sectors, in my mind, giving them a bit of a free pass while avoiding the resource-intensive sectors, creating, in my mind, multiple missed opportunities. So we've identified, and we'll come to this later, but we've identified many companies that have ambitious carbon reduction goals. They have good environmental, social governance scores, but they're simply left out of these funds because they're in utilities, cement, or steel, or airlines. And that, to me, again, many missed opportunities. So if we examine the ESG characteristics of these, the most held versus least held companies, what does that tell us about what managers prefer? It tells us that ESG fund managers prefer the E above all S, overlooking the S, the G, again, creating multiple overlooked risks. So if we look at this chart, you'll see that to the left, the median environmental score of a high conviction portfolio, and in other words, companies most held, is much higher than the exclusions. That means a better environmental score means you're in more ESG funds. You don't see that really for the S and the G. That means that a company in an ESG fund has no really different governance than one not in an ESG fund, suggesting it doesn't matter. Now, most counterintuitive thing I've heard in my life as an ESG analyst, but that's what it suggests. Again, what we have here is a focus on the E, creating multiple overlooked risks on the G. And we can see that a little deeper on this slide, where I've selected companies to the top, which are in many ESG funds, so they have a high conviction score, but they have poor governance across multiple rating providers, sort of like a consensus on poor governance. I mean, case in point is just Tesla. Tesla, highly debatable, ESG, not ESG, we can talk for hours. But at the end of the day, fund managers consider it quite a high conviction stock. Many funds hold Tesla. But very bad governance. Again, multiple overlooked risks. And to the bottom, you have missed opportunities. So these are companies not in any ESG fund. They have a low conviction score, but they have good governance. Case in point, AES. AES is an American utility. They're in no ESG fund we analyze. Good governance. I don't have it here in the slide, but very ambitious carbon reduction goals. But still, not in any ESG fund, probably because it's in the utility sector and has a high carbon intensity today. So again, multiple missed opportunities and overlooked risks. And that's all I have for today. Again, we looked at assets and flows. We said, we need a wider investor base when it comes to ESG. And then we examined some of these fund holdings. And the consensus is really that investors prefer these resource-light sectors. They prefer the E, in my mind, creating many missed opportunities and overlooked risks. That's all I have for you today. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage New York State Comptroller Thomas P. DiNapoli for a conversation with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick.
It's a nice presentation by Shaheen just now. And it was kind of interesting, one of the slides that she had up there kind of talked about the holdings that you see in a lot of these funds that are related to ESG. And it's kind of interesting to see that breakdown, Tom. You see a lot of holdings that are still kind of concentrated in big tech. And at the same time, kind of excluding a lot of, I guess, what we consider carbon intensive industries, whether it's airlines, whether it's some of the oil and gas companies as well. But she also talked about the potential missed opportunity there if these companies indeed are transitioning to whatever our renewable energy future is going to look like.
And I think that's the key point. As some of the audience may know, we have a climate action plan that we developed a number of years ago. And the real focus of that plan is to examine our holdings from the perspective of transition readiness. Understanding that some of the companies that folks might be concerned with their business practices today, the question really is, where are they headed? Do they understand the imperative of the goals of the Paris Agreement? And what kind of business plans they have in place to achieve those goals? And from our perspective, again, being a pension fund, and a large one, our preference is to buy and hold, right? Because we're a perpetual investor. We're not going out of business. We don't have really short-term interest. We have long-term interest, and we're well-funded, so we're very patient capital. So we view ourselves as being perpetual and universal. There are exceptions to it. There are obviously some places we choose not to go to, but looking at the list in that presentation, all those company names are very familiar to me.
How are you making decisions, though? I mean, when you sort of go through your criteria for what sort of meets the standard of sustainability, what meets the standard for the E, the S, and the G, how do you go about that process?
Well, I know this is such a hot topic and obviously the focus of the summit, but I would say, from my perspective as trustee for the fund, I want all of our investments to be considering the E, S, and the G. As a provider of retirement benefits for 1.1 million New Yorkers, I want all of our investments to be sustainable. So I don't think from my perspective we quite see it so segmented or so bucketed out. We would like to have all of our investments have a consideration of what we consider to be risk factors. If you're not adequately assessing the impact of your operations on the broad categories of ESG, then perhaps you're missing opportunities to maximize return. It gets back to risk and return. And again, because we have a perpetual horizon as a pension fund, we want all of our investments to be sustainable. And we think sustainability starts with incorporating ESG considerations.
How do you, though, I guess, make that case? I mean, to, of course, the folks that you're effectively working for, meaning the pension holders. But as I'm sure you know, there's been a lot of criticism overall, not just of New York State, but other state pension plans, and the way that they've ventured into this. Has the case not been made eloquently enough, accurately enough, that there is a direct financial component there to pursuing these strategies?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, we made the case eloquently enough. And, an advantage I have as a sole fiduciary model is that, I make the decisions and the decisions stick until somebody replaces me.
Is that going to happen soon?
No, it's not going to happen anytime soon.
Okay,
I just got reelected last year.
You paused, all right, I'm just checking.
Yeah. I'm not ready to collect my pension yet. No, I mean, and from my perspective, when you see some of what's happening in other states, and you see some of the proposals, at the federal level to limit consideration of ESG, I mean, it is unfortunate it's become part of the political landscape. It shouldn't be. And from my perspective as the fiduciary for the fund, I want to be left alone to make the decisions, which is my responsibility, that investment decisions are in the best interest of our members. That's our purpose. And so, from my perspective, very strongly, I would be not fulfilling my fiduciary responsibility if I was not ensuring that our staff wasn't considering these factors in all of our investment strategy. Again, it's about reducing risk, maximizing return, and so you want to be invested in places where there's an understanding that how the environment is being managed, how employees are being treated, what kind of board governance structure you have. This will have a direct impact on the long-term profitability of whatever the company or the investment opportunity is. You can't separate it out. So we get into this labeling and the politics, and to me, it's separate from reality. Let me just offer this other thought, which may sound counter to some of what some of you may be thinking or talking about today. We don't view what we do as ESG investing. We are investing to secure retirement benefits, and we believe that considering ESG factors is totally tied to the effectiveness of our overall investment strategy. There's not like a bucket of ESG investments. This has to be incorporated in all of your decisions on investment.
But that gets to the marketing of this, and I know this isn't necessarily coming from the state pension funds, but obviously a lot of the funds, the private funds that you have to work with here, and we've seen the pushback, and we've seen to a certain extent some of them cave to a certain extent, either removing some of the labels or at least trying to downplay the ESG aspects of it.
Yeah. Well, I was at a meeting this morning. We were considering an investment, and and the folks that came in said that when they go to some other states, they have to take certain slides out of their presentation. That doesn't mean they're changing their strategy on incorporating ESG. They're just not saying it. And I do think, look, I think, and a lot of it jumped off from, in recent times, the focus on climate and the E part of ESG. I think you're right, it has been a marketing technique. That's okay, right? But it shouldn't get in the way of our continuing to do what we feel we need to do to protect our investments and our pensions, and we're not. So I don't think the label is as important, and we shy away from it, but we don't shy away from the need to evaluate where we're putting our money and making sure that the corporations we're invested in, or even on the private market side, that these factors are considered.
I understand the long-term sustainability factor, particularly for a pension fund, which is in effect perpetual. There is still the year-to-year returns that, of course, we know everyone focuses on.
And it's been harder and harder.
It has been harder and harder for reasons completely unrelated to ESG.
Right.
Does it complicate your job now when we're in a zero interest rate world and everybody's making money, and now we're not in that world and you're talking about climate change, you're talking about DEI initiatives and et cetera? How does that play out?
Yeah. No, I think it is more challenging because I think people are very uncertain and people are very concerned, and they want to be sure whatever decisions you're making, will enhance the bottom line. But it really goes back to, the underpinnings of our whole philosophy on this. We still believe that our bottom line returns will be better protected and in fact enhanced if we continue to evaluate investment opportunities based on these ESG considerations. But you're right, Romain, I will often go to meetings, particularly with retirees, and they'll say, are you doing this ESG investing? Like it's, and it's like, so what exactly do you mean? Well, I don't know, I heard on TV about, yes, I'm very concerned about it. I said, don't be. We're not investing in ESG. We're considering ESG as an area of risk. Do we have certain investments that, we would describe as thematic investments, right? So if we have part of our portfolio dedicated to climate solutions and sustainable investments, specifically $20 billion allocation, but that is a theme. It's not an ESG investment. So the ESG consideration is really how we look at our approach to investment. It is not the what we're investing in.
Understood. A lot of people focus on the E, the climate change, and the other dynamics in that. There's obviously a big focus on the S and some of the social issues as well. I've always felt that some of the low-hanging fruit when it comes to ESG is corporate governance. Yet we don't hear as much of a conversation around that as maybe we should. Why not?
Well, it's an interesting observation. I would say, I've been doing this for a while. When I first started, probably G was what was talked about more so, and then certainly the E came up real fast on the climate issue. And now I think coming out of COVID, the concern about workers and worker rights and so on, the S has been elevated, and diversity, equity, and inclusion in the wake of George Floyd's murder. But it's an interesting question because in many ways the G part, again, sometimes we over-label, over-segment. The G part, if you're looking at, let's say, a board of directors, it's not totally separate from, the E and the S. And sometimes we make a mistake to try to pigeonhole it all. So, issues of executive compensation have always been part of, our corporate engagement, and that continues. The structure of boards, how they operate, what kind of qualifications do you seek out when you're recruiting board members? And now that's also evolved to the question of how diverse are your boards in terms of women, in terms of racial minorities. We have a new initiative now. We just reached out to corporate boards on the issue of disability inclusion, people with disabilities, LGBTQ issues. I mean, you go down the list. But, so it's not quite so separate, the G from the S. Or we've been, for years, taking a lead on disclosure of political spending, which, from my perspective, is probably as much a G issue as that. You could argue maybe it's an S issue, but
why is that important, though?
Well, because again, our question is risk, right? So if you're doing political spending, and I don't mean what the CEO was doing with their personal money or even a PAC that's been set up, but if you're spending corporate dollars for a candidate or a cause or for a lobbying organization, you could argue you shouldn't do it at all, but at least disclose where you're putting the money. so that we as a shareholder could see whether or not that political spending is promoting a candidate or a cause that aligns with your business plan to maximize the return so it's a good profit for us. And so we think sunlight, at the very least, by having disclosure is a key area. And
So you're not opposed to the political spending,
Well,
it's more the transparency of it?
I'll be honest with you, if you ask me my personal opinion, I don't think there should be corporate money political spending. But since obviously that's allowed in the law and Supreme Court decisions, at the very least there should be disclosure.
How would you reconcile, though, the fact that we know a lot of corporations will basically play both sides of the issue? I mean, I've gone through some of these disclosure statements for the companies that do them, and you'll find just as much money going to the pro side of this issue as the con side of this issue.
Well, yeah, and that creates problems for them sometimes. But I think part of the pressure for disclosure has at least had some companies reconsider doing it at all, or certainly scaling it back. I think the fact that there's more scrutiny, I think, has limited, the use of political spending. It would be nice if it was, across the board required disclosure. It's hard for us. I mean, we're in thousands of, obviously thousands of public holdings, to go, company by company to get disclosure. But every year we target a few more and we get some more victories.
But that gets to the idea here, when it comes to the screening criteria, I guess what type of expectations do you put on these companies, whether it's just the passive screening that you're doing or something a little bit more proactive, where you actually are going to those boards and those executives and saying, here's what we want? What's the criteria?
In terms of how we select which ones to...
Correct.
Well, so we have a corporate engagement team, and I've built out that team over recent years, and we have our proxy voting guidelines, we lays out our philosophy on a host of these issues. And then the team evaluates as best they can, again, given the number of places where we put our money, who may seem to be the outliers, either in terms of poor performance on some of what we're considering, or some of the folks that seem to be better performers, but we want a little more information to see if, in fact, they're fulfilling their own stated objectives in this area. And then it really becomes a process of every year then coming up with a list of companies that we're going to be engaging with, either with letters and meetings or a shareholder resolution, or in some cases a derivative lawsuit. I think the next frontier, though, of challenge in this area is on the private market side. Obviously it's a different kind of relationship, a different kind of engagement, and what I've been focusing on more now is at the front end of those kinds of choices about where we put our money, private equity, real estate, infrastructure, wherever, asking these important questions related, getting back to the topic of ESG, at the front end before we put our money, with a manager. Do you have, for your investments in your strategy, do you have an ESG policy? If so, we have a scorecard. How do we measure that? So I think that's the next frontier in this area, is really taking some of the lessons we learned on the public market side, applying it to the private market side.
It's harder to do on the private market
Well, because
side.
once you put your money there, it's hard. It's not like, ultimately as a shareholder, right, you could do a resolution. The ultimate, which we tend to not do very much, is pull your money out, right, to do a divestment, choose not to put money there. That tends not to be our philosophy. We've done it in a few cases. I don't want to say we haven't. But, when you lock your money up for whatever, 7 years in a private equity fund, you want to be sure you have the money with a manager that at least is sensitive on these issues, so that when you do have to do that phone call saying, hey, by the way, I just got a call from, my friends in labor that, the workers are not being treated well on one of your projects, hopefully they would not hang up the phone and say, it's okay, we got your money. Instead, they'll say, okay, let me look into it and see what we can do to resolve that.
Would you still do business if you were screening for a new manager, a new fund? Would you still do business with them if they told you explicitly that we don't really have an ESG policy, or we don't really have a criteria that maybe meets the standard that you've had in the past?
I don't know that we've had a hard and fast rule. I can tell you this, going back a few years ago when we first started asking if you have an ESG policy, the overwhelming majority of the circumstances now is there is an ESG policy. So I think, investors not just like New York Common, but other investors as well, even asking the question, has created a different dynamic. And every now and then, there still are investment opportunities that we're interested in that staff wants to bring to me, and we'll ask the question. They don't have an ESG policy, and you know what? When we ask the question, suddenly they have a policy before we have to make the final decision, which is a good thing. But now we ask more than just, do you have a policy? We have a scorecard to really, dig in a little bit more into the detail of what the policy is about.
Do you think this criteria that your fund has, as well as other state funds, do you think it's actually making a difference on those issues?
I mean, the short answer I would say is yes, but I think there's still a lot of work to do across the board. On we could pick any of the issues under, the ESG categories. We know that, just on the public side, not every corporation is doing what they need to do. Certainly, in terms of, from our perspective, the biggest issue is human capital management. How many companies still have workplaces where discrimination happens, where there are issues of sexual harassment in terms of how employees are being treated. With the renewed push for unionism in our country, we've filed a couple of resolutions now to request freedom of association, to not interfere with workers that want to organize. So just using that one area, if you're not treating your employees in the appropriate way, that's going to make your organization not attract and retain the best and the brightest and the most talented, and not going to get the most out of the employees. So we know there are still big gaps in all of these areas, which is why we think it's a fundamental part, will continue to be, of our strategy to promote the ESG broad category, whatever you want to call it or not call it, because that's how you make corporate America more responsible and a better place to put money and a long-term sustainable investment for us.
What's the continuity of that strategy, given that, of course, at some point we'll have a new governor, we'll have new politicians in Albany who may decide that they want to go in a different direction?
Well, certainly the first part is no term limits for state controller, is number one. But I think number two is keeping the conversation going, because I think there's so much misinformation. And to your earlier points, Romaine, misunderstanding about what ESG really means and what it's all about. So I think we need to, forums like this, and certainly for the larger public out there, try to depoliticize, what's happened now with this whole discussion, because I think it would be a mistake if we allow backward steps in this area, and it would really compromise the ability to maximize return and to reduce risk. That's what ESG consideration is all about.
All right. Well, I think that's a good place to end it. You'll make a good politician one day if you ever want to run.
I think so. I'm still practicing at it, but we'll see.
All right, Tom DiNapoli.
That wraps our morning block of programming. So if you're going to join us for lunch, everyone will be headed that way. We'll have people that will show you where to go. The lunch will be on the 28th floor. For those of you who are registered for the lunch, the Financial Inclusion for a Sustainable Future, which is proudly sponsored by our summit advisor, Principal Financial, that will be on the 29th floor. So you will still go to the 28th floor, and you'll be guided to the 29th floor from there. One thing to mention that we will have for everybody that is on the 28th floor for lunch, around 1:15, we'll be doing our facilitated networking. So we'll have just some topics with a couple of moderators that will be leading those. So after you've enjoyed your lunch around 1:15, just look for the topic and the speaker. I will be up there to guide you so you'll understand how that works, but that is just something to keep an eye out for. We'll be back here at 2 o'clock with the CEO of Chobani. So we'll see you back here then. Thanks so much.
ain't no debating on it. I'm still levitated, I'm heavily medicated. Ironic, I gave him love and they end up hating on me. She told me she loved me and she been waiting. Been fighting hard for your love and I'm running thin on my patience. Needing someone to hug, even took it back to the basics. You see what you got me out here doing? Might have threw me off, but can't nobody stop the movement. Let's go. Left foot, right foot, levitating. Pop stars, do a leap with the baby. I had to lace my shoes for all the blessings I was chasing. If I ever slip, I fall into a better situation. So catch up, go put some cheese on it, get out and get your bread up. They always leaving you far, but you run together. Weight of the world on my shoulders, I kept my head up. Now baby, stand up, cause girl, you
want me, I want you, baby. My sugar boo, I'm levitating. The Milky Way, we're renegading. Yeah, 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 yeah. I got you, moonlight. You're my starlight. I need you all night. Come on, dance with me. I'm levitating. You, moonlight. You're my starlight. I need you all night. Come on, dance with me. I'm levitating. You can fly away with me tonight. You can fly away with me tonight. Baby,